On the day of a respected major's funeral, the cemetery was filled with people paying their respects, high-ranking officers, decorated veterans, family, and friends. But then, something happened that no one expected. A humble man, dressed in a worn suit, walked slowly toward the cemetery gates. In his hand, a folded American flag. He said nothing, but his eyes carried decades of service, and scars only a combat veteran would understand. Before he could enter, the security men stepped forward. Invitation, they asked. He didn't have one, and he didn't need one. He had fought alongside the major, bled on the same foreign soil, but to those guards, he was just an uninvited stranger. Whispers began to spread through the crowd. Some stared with suspicion, others with pity. In that moment, in the middle of a ceremony of honor, the veteran was being humiliated in front of everyone. Then, a strong, commanding voice cut through the cold air. "Is there a problem here?" The crowd parted. A high-ranking general walked forward, his stride sharp, his eyes locked on the veteran. He recognized the man instantly, and what he did next didn't just silence the guards. It transformed the funeral into a moment of unity and respect that no one there would ever forget. And the most surprising part, this story doesn't end at the cemetery. What began that day would go on to change lives forever. The winter air cut through Daniel Hayes' worn wool suit like a blade. He had pressed it the night before, not because it looked new, it didn't, but because today demanded dignity. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, the lining loose in one sleeve, but it was the only suit he owned that still fit. In his left hand, he carried a folded American flag, not the one from his own service. That one was sealed away in a cedar box at home, alongside medals and faded photographs, but the flag of Major William Kerrigan. Kerrigan wasn't just an old comrade. He had been Daniel's commanding officer, his brother in arms, and the man who once saved his life. The cemetery gate stood in the distance, black iron against a backdrop of bare winter trees. A few black sedans lined the narrow road, their engines ticking softly as they cooled in the cold air. Mourners moved toward the central path, their shoes crunching on frozen ground, collars turned up against the wind. Daniel walked slower than the rest, partly because of his limp, the legacy of a firefight in Afghanistan, and partly because every step seemed to bring a new wave of memories. His mind was not in the present. It was in a sun-baked compound half a world away, where Kerrigan's voice had cut through the chaos like a beacon. That day had been one of the worst. A soldier from their unit had been pinned down in an open courtyard, wounded and unable to move. Daniel had frozen for a moment, heart pounding in his ears, until Kerrigan's voice rang out. With me, Hayes on the double, they had moved together, side by side, under enemy fire, dragging the soldier to safety. Kerrigan had taken a round to the shoulder, but had waved it off, refusing evacuation until the mission was done. Daniel remembered the look Kerrigan had given him. Afterward, equal parts relief, pride, and the unspoken knowledge that they'd both survived something they might not have. That look had stayed with him all these years. Now, the man who had led him through hell was lying in a flag-draped coffin at the far end of the cemetery, and Daniel was here to stand one last time in his presence, to honor him the only way he knew how, by showing up. As he reached the gate, a man in a black overcoat stepped forward, palm out. "Sir, this area is for invited guests only," he said, his voice polite but edged with authority. Daniel blinked, momentarily thrown. "I'm here for Major Kerrigan's funeral." The man's eyes flicked over him-worn shoes, frayed suit, face weathered by sun and time. "Do you have an invitation card?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but I served with him. We were in the same unit." The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at two others in matching coats, who stood like sentries just behind him. One of them shifted uncomfortably. The line of mourners behind Daniel began to slow, curious eyes settling on the scene. Someone whispered, "Who is that?" Another voice muttered, "Probably wandered into the wrong service." Daniel felt heat rising in his chest, though the air was freezing. He wasn't here for recognition. He wasn't here to be seen. But the fact that anyone could doubt his right to be there, that they could question his presence at Kerrigan's funeral, felt like an insult to both of them. The man at the gate sighed, his tone softening just slightly. "I'm sorry, sir, but without an invite." And then it happened. A voice carried over the cold air, deep, commanding, and utterly unmistakable. "Is there a problem here?" Heads turned. The voice belonged to General Marcus Ellsworth. Daniel hadn't seen the man in nearly a decade, but there was no mistaking him. His frame was as solid as ever, his posture still carrying the rigid authority of decades in uniform. Even in a civilian coat, he moved like a soldier, precise, deliberate, every step grounded in purpose. The murmurs faded into silence as the general closed the distance. His eyes locked on Daniel. "Hayes," he said, his tone shifting from sharp to something warmer, but no less certain. Daniel stood a little straighter. "Yes, sir." Ellsworth's gaze hardened not at Daniel, but at the man blocking the gate. "This man doesn't need an invitation. He's earned his place here more than most." The gatekeeper faltered. "General," Ellsworth cut him off. "Step aside." The tension in the air broke like a snapped wire. The guards moved back without another word. Ellsworth clasped Daniel's shoulder, looking him square in the eye. "You're with me." And just like that, the eyes of the crowd shifted, not in suspicion now, but in recognition. The whispers died. The moment had turned, though Daniel could still feel the weight of what almost happened. As they walked side by side toward the heart of the cemetery, the cold didn't seem quite as biting. What had just happened at the gate would stay with Daniel for a long time, not because of the embarrassment, but because of the way it had ended. A man he hadn't seen in years had stepped forward without hesitation to defend his honor, and that, Daniel thought, was the kind of loyalty Kerrigan had believed in. The sound of boots on frozen gravel echoed between the rows of white headstones. As Daniel and General Ellsworth made their way toward the center of the cemetery, the air smelled faintly of pine from the wreaths that adorned some graves, but mostly it smelled of cold stone and damp earth, a scent Daniel knew from too many funerals. The general walked in silence for a moment, hands clasped behind his back, the way officers often did when they were thinking. Daniel could feel the weight of his presence. Ellsworth had been one of those rare leaders who commanded not just obedience, but respect, a man whose voice you remembered long after the battle ended. "You're looking older, Hayes," the general said finally, his tone neither teasing nor cruel, just a statement of fact. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. "That happens when you survive this long, sir." Ellsworth nodded, his eyes still forward. "I didn't know you and Kerrigan kept in touch." "We didn't," Daniel admitted. "Not after I got out. But you don't need to keep in touch with a man like him to feel the pull when he's gone. I heard about the funeral from another old unit buddy." The general slowed his pace. "Kerrigan talked about you sometimes. Said you were stubborn enough to get yourself killed, but too lucky for it to happen." Daniel chuckled quietly, but there was a lump in his throat. "He saved me more than once. Guess the luck was his, not mine." As they approached the assembly of mourners, the murmurs quieted. At the far end, under a canopy, the casket rested draped in a crisp American flag, the stars and stripes standing out against the gray sky. The honor guard stood at either end, rifles at their sides, still as statues. Daniel felt a familiar heaviness settle over him. Funerals in the military were their own kind of battlefield, silent, regimented, but heavy with unspoken words, the sharp lines of the uniforms, the precise movements. The salutes, all of it designed to give order to something that was, at its core, chaos. Ellsworth led him to the front row, where high-ranking officers and Kerrigan's family sat. A few eyebrows rose at Daniel's presence, but no one said a word with the general at his side. When the service began, a chaplain in a dark overcoat stepped up to the podium. His voice was deep and steady as he spoke about Kerrigan's career, his leadership, and the lives he had touched. But Daniel barely heard the words. His eyes were locked on the casket. The flag on top reminded him of another day years earlier when Kerrigan had stood beside him at the ramp of AC-17, watching a flag-draped coffin being loaded for the flight home. "Every one of these," Kerrigan had said quietly, "is a promise we didn't keep." At the time, Daniel hadn't fully understood what he meant. Now, he did. The chaplain's voice faded, replaced by the crunch of boots as General Ellsworth stepped forward to speak. He didn't use notes. "I knew William Kerrigan for over 25 years. The general began, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "I knew him as a soldier, a leader, and a friend. He was the kind of man who would take the blame for your mistakes and give you the credit for his victories. In a world full of people who talk about honor, Kerrigan lived it." Ellsworth's gaze swept over the mourners, landing briefly on Daniel. "Some of you here only knew him in uniform. Some of you knew him as a father, a husband, or a neighbor. But all of you should know this: when Kerrigan said he'd stand with you, he meant until the last breath in his body." Daniel felt his chest tighten. The general's words weren't flowery. They were simple, direct, just like Kerrigan had. Ben Ellsworth paused, then added, "And that's why I won't let anyone question the right of those who served with him to be here today. Whether you wore the same uniform or not, whether you've spoken in years or now service binds you, in a way the rest of the world will never quite understand." There was no mistaking the subtle reference. A few heads turned toward Daniel, but the looks were different now, no longer suspicion, but respect. When the general finished, he stepped back. The honor guard took their positions for the 3-volley salute. The sharp cracks of the rifles split the air, echoing off the rows of stone. Each report sent a shiver through Daniel, not from the cold, but from the memories it stirred. After the last volley, a lone bugler stepped forward, raising the trumpet. The first notes of taps floated out over the graves, haunting and pure. Daniel had heard it more times than he cared to count, but it never failed to hollow him out. When the last note faded, two soldiers approached the casket with precise movements. They folded the flag, each crease sharp, deliberate. One of them handed it to the general, who turned and walked straight to Kerrigan's widow. Daniel's eyes burned as he watched Ellsworth kneel, offering the flag with steady hands. His voice, though quiet, carried to Daniel's ears. "On behalf of a grateful nation and the United States Army, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." Kerrigan's widow nodded, clutching the flag to her chest. The formal part of the ceremony ended, and people began to step forward to pay their final respects. Some left flowers, others simply bowed their heads in silence. When it was Daniel's turn, he walked slowly to the casket, leaning heavier on his cane than before. He placed the folded flag. He brought not Kerrigan's official funeral flag, but the one from their last deployment, on the ground beside the casket. He rested his hand on the wood, closing his eyes. "You did right by all of us, Bill, even when we didn't deserve it." A warm hand landed on his shoulder. He turned to find the general beside him again. "You'd have went through hell together," Ellsworth said softly. "I could see it in your eyes when you walked up." Daniel nodded. "It doesn't feel right, him being gone. Men like Kerrigan aren't supposed to leave." The general gave a faint smile. "They don't, Hayes. Not really. They just stop, standing beside you, and start standing behind you." For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind rustled through the bare branches overhead, and the quiet stretched. Then Ellsworth straightened. "Come on, let's get a coffee. We've got some catching up to do." Daniel looked back at the casket one last time before following. In his mind, he could almost hear Kerrigan's voice again, steady, confident, telling him to keep moving forward. And for the first time in years, Daniel thought maybe he could. The coffee shop near the cemetery was small, warm, and smelled faintly of cinnamon. The general ordered black coffee. Daniel asked for the same. They sat in a corner booth, away from the quiet chatter of the other customers. For a while, they spoke in fragments, small talk about mutual acquaintances, about who had retired, who had passed. But inevitably, the conversation drifted to the memory that hung between them like smoke. "You remember Sanger Valley?" Ellsworth asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. Daniel let out a slow breath. "I remember everything about it." The Sanger Valley mission had started like most deployments did, on paper, clean and clear. Their unit was tasked with providing overwatch for an Afghan National Army patrol, a simple job, according to the briefing. But nothing in Afghanistan stayed simple for long. Daniel could still feel the oppressive heat that day. The way the dust clung to his sweat-soaked uniform, the air had smelled of diesel and gun oil. Kerrigan had been leading the squad, his radio crackling with clipped updates from higher command. They had just reached the outer edge of a small village when the first shots rang out. Not sporadic fire, an orchestrated volley, aimed and deliberate. Bullets kicked up dirt inches from their boots. The on patrol scattered, taking cover wherever they could find it. "Contact, east side, move." Kerrigan's voice was a whip. "Crack over the COMMS." Daniel and two others sprinted toward a low wall, pressing themselves flat against it as rounds snapped overhead. He could hear the distinct thump of an RPG launching somewhere in the hills. Seconds later, the blast threw a plume of dirt and debris into the air behind them. Kerrigan were pinned. Daniel shouted into the mic. "I see you," came the calm reply. "Always calm. Hold your position. I'm moving to you." It wasn't standard procedure for the commanding officer to advance into a hot zone, just to pull out a couple of grunts. But Kerrigan wasn't one to stand back when his men were exposed. Moments later, Daniel saw him appear through the haze, moving low and fast, his M4 tight to his shoulder. On me, Kerrigan barked. The next few minutes were a blur. They moved in short bursts, cover, fire, move until they reached a mud brick compound that offered better protection. Inside, they found Corporal Ruiz, bleeding heavily from a leg wound. The Honor troops had fallen back, leaving the Americans isolated. Kerrigan dropped to one knee beside Ruiz, applying a tourniquet with quick, practiced hands. "You're not dying on my watch, Ruiz," he said, his tone somewhere between a promise and a command. The enemy fire didn't let up. Daniel could hear them shouting in the distance, coordinating their next move. The radio crackled again, HQ warning them that reinforcements were still at least 20 minutes out. 20 minutes, Daniel muttered. "We're not going to last 20 minutes here." Kerrigan looked up, eyes sharp. "Then we make them last 20 minutes. He handed Daniel extra mags, then positioned himself at a small opening in the wall. "Hayes, I'm not leaving this compound until Ruiz is on a bird heading home. That clear?" "Clear," Daniel said, and meant it. The next stretch of time was measured not in minutes, but in bursts of gunfire. The enemy tried flanking twice. Both times, Kerrigan's steady aim and clip commands drove them back. At one point, Daniel glanced over and saw Kerrigan reloading with mechanical precision. His face set in grim determination. There was no fear there, just focus. When reinforcements finally arrived, the sound of approaching Humvees was almost drowned out by the continuing firefight. Kerrigan coordinated their extraction as if reading from a script, making sure Ruiz was loaded first, then waving Daniel toward the vehicle. But Daniel saw it then, the blood soaking through Kerrigan's right shoulder. "You're hit," Kerrigan shrugged. "Just a scratch. Get in the truck." Only later, when they were back at the FOB, did Daniel realize the wound was deep enough to require surgery. Kerrigan never mentioned it again. Back in the coffee shop, Daniel stared into his cup, the steam curling upward. "That was the last mission we ran together," he said quietly. "After that, I rotated home." He stayed. Ellsworth nodded slowly. "I read the after-action report, but reports don't tell you what a man's made of. You have to be there for that." Double quotes. Daniel looked up. "He was made of steel, sir, but he never used it to cut people down. He used it to hold them up." The general's eyes softened, though his voice stayed steady. "And that's why what happened at the gate today bothered me so much. Men like Kerrigan and men like you should never have to explain why you belong at a comrade's funeral." The words settled heavily between them. Outside, snow had begun to fall, thin flakes drifting past the window. Daniel watched them for a moment, then said, "You know, he used to say something to me after a mission. One day, someone's going to have to stand up for you the way you stand up for others." Ellsworth took a slow sip of his coffee. Looked like today was that day. They sat in silence for a while, each man lost in his own thoughts. The funeral, the firefight, the years in between, they were all threads of the same story. A story of service, sacrifice, and a quiet kind of brotherhood that didn't end when the uniforms came off. Finally, Daniel pushed his empty cup aside. "I'm glad you were there today, sir. Not just for me, but for him, for Kerrigan." The general nodded once, firmly. "So am I, Hayes, so am I." By the time Daniel and General Ellsworth stepped back outside, the snow had picked up. It wasn't heavy yet, but the flakes were thick, falling in slow spirals that made the cemetery look like it belonged in a black and white photograph. The crowd from the funeral had mostly dispersed. A few cars still idled along the lane, their exhaust curling into the cold air. Off in the distance, a small group of younger soldiers, probably members of the Honor Guard, stood talking quietly. Daniel was about to thank the general again for his intervention when a voice called out from behind them, "Hayes." Daniel turned, puzzled. A man in his mid-30s was approaching, wearing a dark pea coat and a scarf. His hair was short, military neat, but there was something else familiar about him, something in the eyes. "You probably don't remember me," the man said, stopping a few steps away. "I'm Captain Well, former Captain Matt Ruiz." For a moment, Daniel just stared. Then it hit him. "Corporal Ruiz," he said slowly, the memory unfolding like a photograph in his mind. "Sanger Valley." Ruiz nodded, smiling faintly. "That's the one." Ellsworth looked between them, clearly aware of the history, but letting the moment play out. "You made it home," Daniel said, still a little stunned. "Last time I saw you, you were bleeding out on a compound floor. And last time I saw you," Ruiz replied, "you and Major Kerrigan were dragging me to a Humvee like the enemy wasn't trying to take our heads off." Daniel chuckled softly. He was the one keeping us alive. I was just along for the ride. Ruiz's expression shifted, becoming more serious. That's not how I remember it. I remember you keeping me talking so I wouldn't black out. I remember you shoving that tourniquet tighter when I screamed for you to stop. You saved my life. Hayes. Both of you did. The snow continued to drift around them, softening the edges of the moment. Daniel felt the weight of those words. He'd never thought much about what came after for Ruiz, whether he'd stayed in the service, whether he'd heal. Now, seeing him here, alive and standing on his own 2 feet, felt like a quiet miracle. What are you doing here? Daniel asked finally. Ruiz's gaze flicked toward the canopy where the casket had been just hours earlier. I came to pay. My respects. Kerrigan wrote me a letter when I was still recovering stateside. Told me not to waste my second chance. I've been trying to live up to that ever since. Ellsworth stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm. Kerrigan had that effect on people. He didn't just save lives, he made people want to be worthy of being saved. Ruiz nodded. That's exactly it. There was a pause, and then Ruiz reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, weathered challenge coin, its edges worn smooth by years of handling. He held it out to Daniel. Kerrigan gave me this. The day before Sanger Valley, Ruiz said it was from his first deployment, back when he was still a lieutenant. Told me to carry it until the day I could give it to someone who'd done for me what he'd done for others. I think he'd want you to have it. Daniel hesitated, staring at the coin. It was small, but in that moment it felt heavier than the folded flag he'd carried earlier. He looked up at Ruiz. Are you sure? Ruiz smiled faintly. I've been carrying it for over a decade, but after today, I know where it belongs. Daniel took the coin slowly, feeling the cool metal against his palm. The engraving was faded, but the unit emblem was still visible. It was a piece of Kerrigan 1 that had survived firefights, deployments, and the slow erosion of time. Thank you, Daniel said quietly, the words inadequate for what he felt. They stood there for a while longer, 3 men bound by the memory of the same battlefield ghost. Eventually, Ruiz shook their hands and headed toward his car, his footsteps leaving clear prints in the fresh snow. Ellsworth and Daniel began a slow walk toward the gate. The general glanced at him. You realize what that coin means, don't you? Daniel nodded. It's not just a memento. It's a charge, a reminder to keep standing up for the people who can't stand up for themselves. Ellsworth smiled faintly. Sounds like Kerrigan passed it on to the right man. As they reached the gate, Daniel paused. From here, the cemetery stretched out in neat lines of white stone, each marker a story, each name a chapter in a book only a few had read. He slipped the coin into his pocket, feeling its weight settle. They're like an anchor, you know, Daniel said slowly. I came here today just to say goodbye, but now it feels like I've been given something to carry forward. The general nodded once, firmly. That's how you honor him, not by standing still, but by moving forward with what he gave you. They parted ways there, Ellsworth heading toward his waiting car and Daniel starting the long walk back down the lane. The snow was falling thicker now, muffling the sounds of the world, wrapping everything in a kind of hushed dot. Daniel thought of Kerrigan, not the man in the coffin, but the one who had charged into a hot zone without hesitation, who had risked everything for the men beside him, who had believed in loyalty above all else. And he thought of Ruiz alive because of that loyalty, standing tall because of it, carrying forward the lessons Kerrigan had left behind. By the time Daniel reached the end of the lane, he knew one thing for certain. Kerrigan might be gone, but the mission wasn't over. Not for him. Not yet. The following week, Daniel found himself sitting at his kitchen table, the folded flag from Kerrigan's funeral resting in front of him. Beside it lay the challenge coin from Ruiz, the metal catching faint light from the window. He'd taken it out of his pocket every morning since the funeral, turning it over in his hand like a ritual. For days, he'd been thinking about what General Ellsworth had said at the gate. You've earned your place here. At the time, it had felt like a shield against embarrassment. Now, it felt like a challenge, one that went beyond that snowy afternoon. Daniel had lived quietly since leaving the army. He worked odd jobs, kept to himself, stayed away from gatherings where he might be asked about the old days. The scars, both visible and invisible, had made him wary of being around people who didn't understand them. But standing at Kerrigan's grave, meeting Ruiz again, and hearing Ellsworth's words had stirred something he thought was long buried. The question was, what was he going to do about it? He didn't have an answer until he found himself driving to the local VFW post. He hadn't been there in years, not since his discharge. The parking lot was half full. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee, beer, and the unmistakable scent of old wood. A few men in worn caps sat at a table playing cards. Others were gathered near the bulletin board. A younger man, maybe late 20s, looked up from a laptop at the front desk. "Can I help you?" Daniel hesitated. "I'm looking to get involved again. Maybe help out with veteran outreach, or whatever you've got for an old infantryman." The man smiled. "We've always got room for that. Got a lot of guys who could use someone who's been there to talk to." That was how it started. Over the next few weeks, Daniel found himself spending more time at the post. He sat in on meetings, helped organize rides for vets who couldn't get to appointments, and even visited a few in the hospital. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was the kind of work Kerrigan would have respected. Quiet, steady, unyielding. One evening, as Daniel was locking up, he caught sight of the coin in his pocket again. He thought about Ruse's words. "I think he'd want you to have it." That coin wasn't just a token, it was a mission statement. He decided to make it more than symbolic. He started something he called the Kerrigan Challenge. It wasn't official, just a personal effort. The idea was simple. Every month, he would find one veteran and need someone falling through the cracks and do something tangible to help pay a bill, fix a broken porch, drive them to AVA appointment. No publicity, no recognition, just quiet service. The first month, he helped a retired sergeant named Wallace get his truck running again. The second, he arranged home repairs for a widowed Navy corpsman. By the third month, word had started to spread, not because Daniel talked about it, but because the people he helped did. One day, as he was finishing up repairs on an old veteran's fence, he got a call from a number he didn't recognize. "Hayes," the voice said. "It's Ruiz." Daniel grinned. "Haven't heard from you in a while. How's life treating you?" "Better," Ruiz said. "Listen, I've been thinking about what you told me after the funeral, about carrying things forward. There's a vet here in my town who needs help, and I can't do it alone. Thought maybe we could take this Kerrigan Challenge on the road." Daniel felt something warm in his chest. "Yeah," he said, "let's do it." They made plans, and within a week, Daniel was on the road, heading toward Ruse's town. It struck him as he drove, this was what Kerrigan had meant all along. You didn't honor a man like him with speeches or medals. You honored him by living the way he had lived, by standing up for the people who needed it, no matter where they were, no matter what it cost. Months passed, and the quiet work continued. Sometimes it was just Daniel. Sometimes it was Daniel and Ruiz. Other times, other veterans joined in. The circle grew, not organized, not formal, but bound by the same unspoken oath. One spring afternoon, Daniel found himself back at the cemetery. The snow was long gone, replaced by green grass and the hum of insects in the warm air. He stood in front of Kerrigan's headstone, the challenge coin warm in his palm. "Bill," he said quietly, "I don't know if I'm getting it right, but I'm trying, and I'm not doing it alone anymore." A breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Daniel closed his fist around the coin, feeling its weight. When he turned to leave, he noticed someone walking toward the grave, a young soldier in uniform, probably no older than 25. The soldier glanced at him and nodded respectfully before kneeling at the headstone. Daniel realized then that the chain would never break, not as long as there were people willing to remember, to step forward, to carry the weight. As he walked back to his truck, he thought about the gate at Kerrigan's funeral, the whispers, the doubt, the moment when Ellsworth had stepped in. That day had started as a farewell and ended as a beginning. The mission wasn't over, not for him, not ever. Standing at Kerrigan's grave that spring afternoon, Daniel realized something important. The challenge coin in his pocket wasn't just a keepsake, it was a responsibility. What happened at the funeral had started as a moment of humiliation, but it ended as a reminder of what true loyalty looked like. General Ellsworth's public defense, Ruse's gratitude, and Kerrigan's example had all pointed toward the same truth. Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Daniel knew he couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring back the brothers he'd lost or undo the scars left behind by war, but he could carry their values forward, and that's exactly what he planned to do. The Kerrigan Challenge, his quiet, personal mission to help one veteran in need each month, wasn't about recognition. It was about living the way Kerrigan had led, with honor, sacrifice, and an unshakable sense of duty. As he turned to leave, Daniel glanced back one last time. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the neat rows of headstones. Somewhere behind him, a younger soldier approached the grave, another link in a chain that would never break. Because loyalty like that doesn't fade. It's passed on, one act at a time. And if you've watched this far, maybe you're part of that. Chained to dots, so ask yourself, who can you stand up for today?